Hello, my name is Nick Fox. I am a research scientist at the Center for Open Science. Previously, I was a graduate student at Rutgers University. And if you're watching this, then you may have scanned the QR code on my poster at Metascience 2019. So, hello, welcome. Thank you for stopping by. A link to the poster, if you want to look at it again, is down below, as well as a link to the preprint of the paper that this work is associated with, as well as my PhD dissertation, which this was a part of, is all available down below. So click those links if you want to see more work in a fully fleshed out way. So I want to take the next few minutes kind of unpacking the poster and the things that we did for this work. My work focused on estimating the size of the population of QRP users in psychology. So questionable research practices, or QRPs, are behaviors that researchers can use during data collection, data analysis, manuscript preparation that can introduce false positives into the published research. And so we know these things are happening given the current replication crisis. And there have been estimates of how many people use QRPs, but these estimates have been very variable. So some estimates have put QRP use as high as 60%, over 60%, and other estimates have put it lower, below 10%. And so this work focused on using 3 different estimating techniques to try and get a better, more clear view of what the size of this QRP using population is. Beyond that, this work also looked at whether or not QRP using psychologists are a stigmatized subpopulation of the field of psychology. So are there 2 groups of psychologists, the stigmatized group who are using QRPs and the non-stigmatized group? That's what this work was focusing on. So first, the 3 estimators. The first estimate was the direct estimate. So this asked participants directly if they have used a questionable research practice in the past 12 months. So there were 308 participants. They were all psychologists in the United States associated with PhD granting graduate departments. And with 308 participants, we estimated a little over 18% of them had used at least one of these 9 questionable research practices in the past 12 months. So about 1 in 5. The second estimate was the unmatched count technique. So this is a technique that's a more indirect estimate where participants don't have to identify to the researchers that they are a QRP user or not. So it's anonymous on their end. They don't say, I'm a QRP user. They actually just mark different statements. They count how many statements are accurate to them. So they're only reporting a number of statements, not necessarily which statements are accurate to them. So using the unmatched count technique, we estimated about 10% of psychologists have used a questionable research practice in the past 12 months. Though we also had a very large confidence interval around this estimate, and so far we believe that this is due to the relatively low number of participants, 279, and the sensitivity that this estimate has towards sample size. So future work would very much benefit in doing this estimate again with a much larger sample size. We were only able to get 279 participants given how this work was structured. And the third estimate, which I think is the most exciting, it's the most new in psychology, was the Generalized network scale-up method. So what this did was, instead of asking participants directly if they had used a QRP, either asking them to identify or to count items, they still have to self-identify, they have to label that number in the unmatched count. We asked them instead to consider their social networks and to say, how many psychologists do you know in your social network that have used at least one of these behaviors in the past 12 months? So instead of reporting on their own behavior, they're reporting on the behavior of others in their social network. Now, you might say, well, QRP use is not something I can tell in my peers. It's not something I can look at and say, oh, that person's a QRP user. It's not like hair color or eye color. And that's true. And so what we did was to adjust the estimate. In those people who self-identified as questionable research practice users, we asked them further questions that gauge the transmissibility of their QRP use identity. So given that you are a QRP user, since you've self-identified as one in an earlier question, how transmissible is that information? So there's a method called the game of contacts, where we ask them about individuals in their social network and ask them to say, does this person know about your QRP use, and do you know about their potential QRP use? So in the way that information can flow between two people in a social network, how free is that information to flow? And what we found was it's not very free at all. The estimate is a 6% transmissibility index. 6% is very small, so most psychologists don't know the identity of their peers who are using questionable research practices. But when we take that and we adjust the social network estimate, we get an estimate of about 24%, which means that, again, about 1 in 5, 1 in 4 psychologists have used at least one questionable research practice in the past 12 months. So the fact that both the direct estimate and the social network estimate gave similar estimates, 18%, 24%, gives us some confidence that we are estimating something that exists in about the 1 in 5 range. The confidence interval is large for the social network scale-up estimate, and that's because we're estimating many parameters. We're estimating the social network size of participants. We're estimating the transmissibility of QRP identity. We're estimating the social network size difference between QRP users and the general population. So there are many more parameters that are being estimated, and to protect ourselves from how much variance that's there, because of all these estimates, they're not known values, that does generate a larger confidence interval, which you'll see in the figure on the poster. So that was the estimates of the population size of QRP users. So about 1 in 5, right? So if you look in, a faculty department or, at a conference, a fair number of psychologists have used these behaviors recently. So not pre-2010, not in the 70s or 80s. This is 2015, 2016, 2017, several years after the beginning of the current replication crisis. So beyond just estimating the number of psychologists who have used questionable research practices, we also looked at how they exist in their social network. Are they stigmatized or not? Now, in the literature, stigma, if you look at Goffman, the concealment of a stigmatized identity is a big thing. And what we saw with transmissibility, at least, was that QRP use is a concealed identity. So we asked additional questions to participants who were not asked about their own QRP use. We kept them kind of in the control so they weren't primed by their own behaviors. We asked them what their opinions were about psychologists who used questionable research practices. And we asked them in certain domains associated with stigma. So we asked them about their fear of psychologists who use QRPs. We asked about the attribution of QRP use. Do people use QRPs because of some external force bearing down on them, the pressures of being an academic? Or is it because of something intrinsic to them as a person? Is it because that they are intrinsically worse at science than someone who doesn't use a questionable research practice? We also asked about whether or not using questionable research practices broke social norms. And we also measured the age of the participant. Would there be more or less stigma towards a questionable research practice user for psychologists who were younger or older? And what we found was that younger psychologists tend to stigmatize QRP users more compared to older psychologists. And there's a graph on the poster on one of these sides, looking at age as a continuous IV on stigma of QRP users. We found that those who believe that QRP use breaks social norms were more likely to stigmatize against QRP users. And also those who found that QRP users were a threat to their graduate students. We found that those participants would also have a higher stigma towards QRP users. And beyond just measuring the attitudes of psychologists towards questionable research practice users, we also looked at two behaviors that questionable research practice users may use to shield themselves from the stigmatized identity that they carry. One of those is selective disclosure, which goes again to the transmissibility of QRP use identity. And the other is social withdrawal. So in order to protect yourself from being accidentally outed as a QRP user, one strategy would be to reduce the number of social network ties you have, to kind of withdraw from society. If you have a smaller social network, the likelihood that you will be outed as a QRP user would be lower. So what we found was there was over a 90 times higher odds ratio for participants who were self-identified QRP users to disclose that information to other people in their social network that they had identified as QRP users. So having a shared identity of QRP use increased the odds that that information would be transmitted across the social network. If it was known that an alter in the social network was not a QRP user or was unknown if they were a QRP user, that probability of sharing QRP identity was much, much lower. So there was evidence of selective disclosure. When we looked at social withdrawal, there was not any significant evidence for that. The social network sizes for QRP users who identified themselves as such, and the general population of psychologists, their social network size averages nearly overlapped. It was the ratio was 0.97. So there was not significant evidence for social withdrawal, but there was for selective transmission of QRP use identity to others that shared that concealed identity, which would be consistent with stigma theory. So in conclusion, what my work found was, depending on the estimator used, about 18 to 24% of psychologists have used at least one questionable research practice in the past 12 months, so recently. And those QRP users are a stigmatized subpopulation of psychologists. Now, this is important information because now that we know the size of the QRP using population and that they are a stigmatized subgroup, we can start to think about how we can shape interventions that can better deal with this population. So if the goal is to reduce the number of false positive findings in the literature, which I think is a very admirable goal for replicatable science, then we need to think about how we can change the behaviors of 1 in 5 psychologists. It's a large number. So there are things already out there like pre-registrations, registered reports. These are great first steps. One way to measure their efficacy is to now do another QRP population size estimate in the future and say, okay, in 2019, the population size was about 1,200 psychologists, about 1 in 5 psychologists. After 5 years of registered reports, after 10 years of pre-registration, has that number gone down? And that would give you an idea of, it's like a natural experiment. Do these interventions lead to the reduction in size of the QRP using population? That's an open question. We'll have to look at that in the future. But having this baseline estimate will be the first step. We need something to compare a future estimate to. And knowing that they're stigmatized is also important. If you look at the public health literature, stigma can be used to be either increased. If you increase the stigma on someone, that you can reduce their behavior. So think about the smoking literature, the cigarette smoking literature specifically. Stigma has been increased on cigarette smokers since the 1970s and 1980s, and that has led to a reduction in people who smoke cigarettes, mainly due to increasing fear and increasing stigma of the dangers of smoking. You can also decrease stigma. You can help people identify that they have used these behaviors and that they need to change the way they think about writing manuscripts and how they analyze data. So if you look at the literature on sexual orientation, sexual identity, these are areas where stigma has been seen as a problem. And so by reducing stigma, you help individuals and society as a whole, in this case, understand that there are different behaviors and different things that are going on. So in the QRP state, we would say, hey, I've used a QRP. I wasn't aware of the problem that it was causing. I'm glad that, there's this increased awareness, and it would be great if I could get some help in figuring out how to minimize the probability that I'll increase false positive findings in the literature. So knowing that there's a stigma there is important when making interventions that will interact with this population. So again, if you want to see more information, check out the links below to the poster and to the manuscript preprint and to the dissertation. It currently is being sent out for journal review, so it should be published soon. Thanks again for stopping by the poster. If I saw you, It was great to meet you. If I didn't see you, I hope to see you again in the future. And if you have any questions, please do send me an email. I'll put the information in the box below. And I'd love to chat and talk about this work. It's something I'm very passionate about. And hope to see you soon. Bye.